Most people were taught that the ancient world had a handful of great civilizations: Greece, Rome, Mesopotamia, Egypt. 4 names, roughly the same latitude, roughly the same story of how humanity climbed out of the dark. What almost no one was taught is that this is not a summary of ancient history. It is a summary of which ancient histories got written down in languages that European scholars could read. The rest of the world did not sit still while that was happening. Africa, in particular, did not sit still. For nearly a century, while Rome was still a city of mud, brick, and timber, while Athens was still 2 generations from its golden age, a dynasty of African kings from the Upper Nile ruled the most powerful civilization on earth. They built pyramids, they commanded armies, they sent ships down the Mediterranean. They sat on the throne of the Pharaohs. Their names were Kashta, Piye, Shabaka, Taharqa. They were not Egyptian. They were Kushite, from the kingdom to Egypt's south, the kingdom that had watched Egypt for 1,000 years, had traded with it, had fought it, and in the end had walked into it and taken the crown. That is not a footnote. That is the beginning of a story most people have never been told. Africa is not a small place. On the maps most people grew up with, it looks roughly comparable to Europe, perhaps a little larger than the continental United States. It is, in fact, neither. The entire United States fits inside Africa with room to spare. So does China. So does India, Western Europe, and most of the eastern seaboard of South America. Africa is 30 million square kilometers of the Earth's surface, the second largest landmass on the planet. And for most of human history, it was not empty. It was full. The distortion on the map is a visual accident of geometry, the consequence of projecting a sphere onto a flat surface, and it has no deliberate author. But its effect has been anything but neutral. When a continent looks small, it is easy to imagine it as peripheral. When it looks peripheral, it is easy to imagine its history as thin. The history of ancient Africa is not thin. It is broken, and broken in very specific ways, for very specific reasons that have nothing to do with whether things happen there. The first reason the record is broken is climate. Warm, humid conditions, the kind that define the rainforest belt of Central Africa and the wet savannas of the West, are the natural enemies of organic material. Wood rots, thatch dissolves, leather turns to powder. Even fired clay deteriorates under the relentless pressure of heat and moisture, cycling year after year across centuries. The civilizations that lived in those zones were real and often sophisticated, but the materials they built with have largely returned to the earth. The archive did not survive because the environment did not allow it. The second reason is material choice. Across much of ancient Africa, the logic of construction was rational and ecologically sensible. You built your domestic spaces, your homes, your markets, your palaces, your storerooms, from the materials available and renewable. That meant wood and thatch, mud brick, and compressed earth. You built your sacred and mortuary structures from stone because those were the spaces meant to outlast a human life. That logic was not unique to Africa. It was common to much of the ancient world. But it meant that what survived was not a representative sample of what existed. It was the ritual and the funerary, not the daily, not the political, not the commercial. The third reason is text. Several ancient African civilizations developed their own writing systems. The Kushites of the Upper Nile used Meroitic script from around 300 BCE, inscribing temple walls and royal monuments in a language that remains only partially understood today. The people of the Ethiopian highlands used Ge'ez, one of the oldest continuously used writing systems on Earth, originating around the 8th or 9th century BCE. The Berber peoples of the Sahara used Tifinagh, a script whose ancestral form is over 2,500 years old. These were not cultures without literacy. They were cultures whose literacies have been imperfectly recovered. But across much of the continent, particularly in the West and the center, knowledge was not stored in text at all. It was stored in people. Griots in the Western Sahel carried the genealogies, laws, and histories of entire kingdoms inside them, transmitting them generation by generation with the same discipline and accuracy that a scriptorium applied to parchment. The oral archive was not a lesser form of record. It was a different one. Its vulnerability was not decay. Its vulnerability was discontinuity. The death of the carrier, the collapse of the institution, the severing of the chain. The fourth reason the record is broken is recovery. Even where evidence survives, what gets excavated depends on where excavators look. And for most of the 20th century, the archaeology of sub-Saharan Africa was chronically underfunded, understaffed, and in some colonial-era periods, actively distorted by administrators who refused to accept that the structures they were finding could have been built by Africans. Great Zimbabwe was not an isolated case. Across the continent, sites that did not fit the prevailing model of African primitivism were explained away, misattributed, or simply left in the ground. The fifth reason is simply the continent's scale. Africa covers more than 30 million square kilometers. It contains every major ecological zone on Earth: desert, rainforest, highland plateau, coastal plain, river valley, savanna. A civilization that rose and fell in the highlands of what is now Ethiopia left almost nothing in common with one that rose and fell in the forests of what is now Nigeria. They were separated by geography as dramatic as the gap between the Mediterranean world and the steppes of Central Asia. Treating Africa as a single unit is not wrong. It is useful, but it requires constant awareness that within that unit are dozens of separate ecological and cultural worlds, each with its own archive problem. This matters because the archive problem is not uniform. The dry north, Egypt, Nubia, the Saharan margins, preserves extraordinarily well. Stone survives. Papyrus survives in arid tombs. Even organic material, sealed in desert sand, can last thousands of years. The wet south and west preserve poorly. The same civilization, had it risen 2,000 kilometers south, would have left a fraction of the record. What we know about ancient Africa is therefore heavily biased toward the north and toward the stone, not because the north was more civilized, but because the north's archive survived. 10. Somewhere around the first millennium BCE, a network of iron-smelting cultures was spreading across the sub-Saharan interior. Iron was not adopted from outside. In several regions, Africans developed smelting independently, and in some cases earlier than the technologies that arrived from the Mediterranean world. Iron tools meant cleared land. Cleared land meant settled agriculture at scale. Settled agriculture meant surplus. Surplus meant hierarchy, specialization, trade. The sequence that produced cities and states was playing out across the African interior at the same time it was playing out everywhere else on Earth. The difference is that wood and mud remembered almost none of it. By the middle of the first millennium CE, there were cities in the African interior with populations measured in the tens of thousands. There were trade networks stretching from the West African goldfields to the Mediterranean coast, from the East African shoreline to the ports of India and the Persian Gulf. There were courts, laws, armies, currencies, and systems of administration sophisticated enough to manage empires across vast territory. None of this was secret knowledge. Some of it was written down by Arab geographers who visited and were astonished. What was missing was not the history. What was missing was the stone. The European encounter with Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries arrived at a particular moment, after the great Sahelian empires of the medieval period had either contracted or fragmented, after the trans-Saharan trade had shifted in response to changing demand, after droughts and political upheaval had reshuffled the map. The scholars and merchants, and eventually the colonizers who formed the image of Africa that entered European consciousness, did not see it at its medieval peak. They saw it through a narrow window, and through that window, they concluded there was nothing to see. That conclusion then shaped everything that followed. What got recorded, what got excavated, what got taught, what got funded. It also shaped, paradoxically, some of the responses to it. The corrective impulse, the one that says Africa had history and here is the list of civilizations to prove it, can itself become a trap because a list of names is not understanding. Kush, Mali, Aksum, Great Zimbabwe. These are not proof points in an argument. They are worlds, and the only way to understand what was lost and why is to go inside them one at a time. So that is what this does. Not to rehabilitate, not to correct, but to look at what was built, at who built it, at how it was connected, and at the ruthless, impersonal logic that determined what would survive the centuries and what would not. The archive problem is not a conspiracy. It is not a cover-up. It is physics and climate and the sociology of scholarship. And once you understand it clearly, yet the history of ancient Africa stops being a gap and starts being the most epistemologically interesting story on earth. Egypt has always been caught between two stories. In one, it belongs to world history, to the story of how human beings built states, written languages, monumental architecture, and systems of belief capable of lasting 3,000 years. In the other, it belongs to Africa, to the continent whose ancient achievements have been systematically minimized, misattributed, and drained of context. These two stories feel like they should be the same story. For most of the last 2 centuries, they have been told as if they were separate ones. The separation began in earnest in the early 19th century, when European scholars descended on Egypt following Napoleon's campaigns of 1798 and found a civilization so enormous, so complex, so entirely incompatible with the image of Africa they already carried, that they did the only thing that felt coherent to them. They mentally detached Egypt from its continent. They placed it at the edge of the ancient Mediterranean world, alongside Greece, Rome, and Mesopotamia, and left it there, anchored to the north rather than to the south, connected to Europe rather than to the continent it physically occupied. That intellectual detachment had consequences that still shape how Egypt is taught, displayed, and understood. Walk through almost any major natural history museum in the Western world, and you will find Egypt in its own wing, curated separately from African collections, implicitly placed in a different category of human achievement. The physical geography has never changed. Egypt sits in the northeastern corner of Africa, its western flank bordered by Saharan desert, its southern border marked by the cataracts of the Nile, where the river runs fast and shallow over granite shelves, and the civilization to its south begins. The ancient Egyptians themselves called their country Kemet, the Black Land, a name drawn from the color of the soil deposited each year by the Nile flood. The river was everything. It rose in the Ethiopian highlands and in the lakes of equatorial Africa, carrying sediment thousands of kilometers north before spreading across the valley floor as it receded. That sediment was the engine of Egyptian agriculture, of Egyptian surplus, of Egyptian civilization. Without the rainfall patterns of the African interior, there would have been no flood. Without the flood, there would have been no Egypt. The Nile was not simply a river. It was the organizational spine of an entire society. The narrow ribbon of cultivable land along its banks, rarely more than a few kilometers wide in the south, widening into the delta in the north, concentrated Egypt's population into a linear corridor unlike any other civilization on earth. Farmers worked the black soil in the months after the flood withdrew, planting wheat and barley in the enriched earth. The state taxed the harvest. The surplus funded the temples, the armies, the court, and the monumental building projects that the ancient world found so astonishing and that the modern world still does. But Egypt was not self-sufficient. It had grain in abundance and papyrus for writing, but it had no timber worth speaking of. It had no silver. It had limited copper. It had no incense. What it needed came from two directions. From the north and east came cedar from the forests of Lebanon, copper from Cyprus, silver from Anatolia, luxury goods from the Levantine ports. From the south came everything else: gold, ivory, ebony, exotic animals, incense, and the prestige goods that Egyptian elites used to signal status and that Egyptian temples required for ritual. That southern supply chain ran through Nubia, and Nubia ran it on its own terms. The relationship between Egypt and Nubia was never simple. It shifted across 3,000 years from commercial partnership to military occupation and back to partnership again, with periods of Nubian autonomy, Egyptian conquest, and, ultimately, Nubian rule over Egypt itself. In the earliest periods, when Egypt was consolidating its state under the first dynasties around 3100 BCE, Nubia was already a sophisticated culture with its own cattle traditions, its own pottery, its own burial practices, and its own connection to the trade networks of the African interior. Egypt needed what Nubia had. Nubia knew it. Somewhere around 2300 BCE, Egyptian accounts began mentioning the people to the south in the context of trade expeditions. The Egyptians sent officials into Nubia seeking gold, incense, ebony, ivory, and, recorded with the same commercial matter-of-factness as the other goods, animals and people. The traffic was not one-directional. Nubian mercenary archers served in Egyptian armies. Nubian craftspeople worked in Egyptian workshops. And Nubian elites adopted Egyptian burial customs and Egyptian gods alongside their own. The cultural border between the two civilizations was always more permeable than the political one. Further south still, Egypt reached by sea. The land of Punt, almost certainly located somewhere on or near the Horn of Africa in the region of present-day Eritrea, Ethiopia, and northwestern Somalia, supplied Egypt with myrrh, frankincense, ebony, and living trees that Egyptian expeditions carried back by ship across the Red Sea. The pharaoh Hatshepsut organized the most celebrated of these voyages around 1470 BCE, dispatching 5 ships southward along the coast. The reliefs she had carved at her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri recorded the journey in detail. The landscape, the buildings of Punt, the goods loaded onto the ships, and the people of Punt watching the Egyptians arrive. 10. This matters because it means Egypt was not an isolated civilization on the edge of Africa. It was a node in an African network. The gold in its treasuries came from the upper Nile. The incense burning in its temples came from the Horn. The timber in its shipyards came from the Levant. The grain in its storehouses fed its neighbors. Egypt was in constant, structured, economically essential contact with the African interior. A contact that Egyptian records document, but that the conventional framing of Egypt as a Mediterranean civilization tends to obscure. The question of what ancient Egyptians looked like has generated more heat than almost any other topic in ancient history, and considerably less light. And the population of the Nile Valley was diverse across both time and geography. Northern Egyptians showed closer connections to the peoples of the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean. Southern Egyptians shared heritage with Nubian and Northeast African populations. This was a corridor through which people had been moving for tens of thousands of years, and its population reflected that movement in every direction. The Egyptians did not organize their identity around anything resembling modern racial categories. They organized it around culture, status, and adherence to Ma'at, the principle of truth, order, and cosmic balance that underpinned everything from the law courts to the architecture of the universe. Ma'at was not an abstraction. It was the operating system of Egyptian society. The pharaoh's primary obligation was to maintain it, to keep the Nile flooding on schedule, the harvests coming, the borders secure, the gods appeased, and the dead properly prepared for their passage to the afterlife. When Masat failed, when the floods were too low and the harvests failed, or when the central authority collapsed and the country fragmented, Egyptians experienced it not just as political crisis, but as cosmic disorder. The intermediate periods, when Egypt broke into competing regional powers, were periods of genuine catastrophe in this worldview, and the reunification of the country under a single pharaoh was always experienced as the restoration of the natural order. The pyramids were not built by slaves. The men who quarried and hauled and set the stones were Egyptian workers organized into gangs with names. They fed from state bakeries, treated by state physicians, and buried with enough ceremony to mark them as people whose labor was considered honorable. The workers' village at Giza, uncovered in the late 20th century, showed a community of tens of thousands. Not a prison camp, but a functioning settlement with its own hierarchy, its own culture, and its own connection to the institutions of the Egyptian state. Building a pyramid was not punishment. For the men who did it, it was probably the closest thing their society offered to a permanent mark on the world. By the time the New Kingdom reached its height around 1300 BCE, Egypt was probably the most powerful state on earth. Its armies ranged into the Levant. Its fleet worked the Red Sea. Its temples at Karnak and Luxor were construction projects of a scale that would not be matched in the ancient world until the building of Rome. And yet, even at this peak, the southern connection held. The gold that paid Egypt's armies, funded its temples, and purchased its diplomatic alliances came from the Nubian mines. The state that sat at the center of the ancient world's richest civilization depended quietly and continuously on the African civilization at its back. Understanding Egypt as an African civilization, fully, not partially, does not diminish it. It contextualizes it. It places it back inside the network of connections and dependencies that actually sustained it. It makes visible the relationship with Nubia that would eventually produce the most astonishing reversal in ancient African history, the moment the Southern Kingdom walked north and took the throne. But that story belongs to the next chapter of this continent. Egypt was the archive's great gift to African history. The dry desert air preserved its papyrus, its painted walls, its carved granite, its linen-wrapped dead. No other civilization on the continent left a record so rich or so legible. But that richness has come at a cost. Because Egypt's archives survived and so much else did not, Egypt has absorbed almost all of the available attention. And the civilizations that traded with it, competed with it, and in some cases outlasted it have been left in its shadow, visible only when they entered Egypt's field of vision and disappeared again when they stepped outside it. South of Egypt, where the Nile runs fast and shallow over shelves of granite and the desert presses in from both sides, a civilization took root long before most of the ancient world had learned to read. The people of the Upper Nile, the region the Egyptians called Kush, the region the Greeks called Ethiopia, the region that is now northern Sudan, were farming, herding cattle, mining gold, and building towns at least as early as 2400 BCE. They were not peripheral to the ancient world. For long stretches of ancient history, they were at its center. The first great city of the Upper Nile was Kerma, which rose to prominence around 2000 BCE and became the capital of a state large enough to challenge Egypt directly. Kerma sat in a fertile bend of the Nile, commanding trade routes that ran south into the African interior and north toward Egypt. Its rulers lived in mud brick palaces and were buried in enormous earthen mounds, tumuli, surrounded by the remains of hundreds of royal attendants who accompanied them in death. The scale of those burials speaks to a society of significant surplus and considerable hierarchy, a state capable of organizing and sustaining extraordinary displays of royal power. Egypt and Kerma watched each other carefully. When Egypt was strong, it pushed south, building forts along the Nile cataracts and taxing the gold trade that was Kerma's primary economic lifeline. When Egypt weakened, and it weakened significantly during its second intermediate period, when rival dynasties fractured the country's unity, Kerma moved north. Around 1650 BCE, the Kerma state invaded Upper Egypt and formed an alliance with the Hyksos, a foreign power that had already taken the north. For a period, a Kushite kingdom and a Levantine power divided between them what had been the world's most unified state. Egypt reconsolidated under the new kingdom Pharaohs of the 18th dynasty and struck back with overwhelming force. Around 1504 BCE, Thutmose I drove south past the Fourth Cataract, destroyed Kerma, and absorbed Nubia as an Egyptian province. For the next 500 years, the Upper Nile was governed by an Egyptian viceroy of Kush. Egyptian temples were built at Napata and Abu Simbel. The Nubian elite adopted Egyptian dress, Egyptian gods, and Egyptian hieroglyphics. The gold of Nubia flowed north to fund Egyptian ambitions across the eastern Mediterranean. To most Egyptian eyes, the relationship was settled. It was not settled. The Nubian masses retained their own language, their own burial customs, and their own sense of identity beneath the Egyptian cultural layer. When Egypt entered its third intermediate period in the 11th century BCE, fragmenting again into competing regional powers, the Kushites did not simply watch. They organized. A new Kushite kingdom emerged at Napata, centered on the sacred mountain of Jebel Barkal, which the Egyptians themselves had identified as the southern home of the god Amun. The Kushite rulers who gathered there were not cultural outsiders. They were the most devoted custodians of Egyptian religious orthodoxy in the entire Nile Valley. The devotion was not performance. The Kushite kings at Napata genuinely understood themselves as the rightful heirs of the Amun cult, the legitimate protectors of a religious tradition that Egypt's fractured elites had allowed to decay. When Kashta, the first of the Napatan kings to assert influence over Egypt, extended his authority into Thebes around 760 BCE, he presented it not as invasion, but as restoration. His daughter was installed as a god's wife of Amun, the most powerful religious office in Upper Egypt. The Kushites were not taking Egypt. In their own understanding, they were saving it. His son, Piye, completed what Kashta had begun. Between 743 and 712 BCE, Piye led his army north through Egypt, now defeating a coalition of local dynasts one by one and bringing the entire country under a single authority for the first time in generations. The victory, stela he erected at Jebel Barkal, recorded the campaign in extraordinary detail. The battles, the surrenders, the religious festivals observed even in the middle of military operations, and the moment Piye expressed more anger at the sight of starving horses belonging to a defeated king than he did at the defeat of the king himself. He was not a man who experienced conquest as an abstraction. He experienced it as a sacred obligation. Piye's brother Shabaka moved the royal capital to Memphis and ruled Egypt as its pharaoh with the full apparatus of the office. The double crown, the cartouche, the ritual titles, the divine claims. He commissioned the Shabaka stone. It's a great slab of basalt inscribed with what he believed to be an ancient Memphite theological text, preserving it because he feared the original papyrus was disintegrating. The impulse was conservationist. These were rulers who cared about the tradition they had inherited, who spent their power maintaining what Egypt had built rather than dismantling it. Taharqa, who ruled from 690 to 664 BCE, was the dynasty's summit. Under his reign, Egypt and Kush together formed the largest unified state in the ancient world. He built extensively in both countries, a great colonnade at Karnak in Thebes, temples throughout the Upper Nile, and at Nuri in his Nubian homeland, the largest pyramid ever constructed in the region, a monument that towered over everything that preceded it. He was mentioned in the biblical Book of Kings. Check where his army was credited with marching to the relief of Jerusalem against the Assyrian siege of Sennacherib. Whether or not that intervention was decisive, the reference places Taharqa in the consciousness of three of the ancient world's great civilizations simultaneously: Egyptian, Kushite, and Israelite. 10. The Assyrians ended it. The empire based in Nineveh was the most formidable military machine the ancient world had yet produced, and it was expanding westward and southward with systematic efficiency. Taharqa repelled the first Assyrian invasion of Egypt in 674 BCE. He could not repel the second. In 671 BCE, the Assyrian king Esarhaddon took Memphis, captured members of the Kushite royal family, and drove Taharqa south. 3 years later, Taharqa recaptured Memphis, but the Assyrian grip held. By 663 BCE, under Esarhaddon's son Ashurbanipal, Thebes itself was sacked. The 25th dynasty withdrew to its Nubian homeland, and Egypt passed to a new dynasty under Assyrian patronage. The retreat south was not the end of Kush. It was, in some ways, the beginning of its most distinctive phase. The Kushite state relocated its capital to Meroe, a city on a wide bend of the Nile between the 5th and 6th cataracts, surrounded by savanna rather than desert, and therefore blessed with seasonal rainfall that the arid north could not offer. Meroe had iron ore in abundance and timber to fuel its smelting furnaces. It became one of the ancient world's great centers of iron production. Manufacturing tools and weapons that were traded across sub-Saharan Africa and into the Roman commercial sphere. The slag heaps at Meroe, built up over centuries of smelting, are still visible today. Meroe also produced something else that almost no other ancient state south of the Mediterranean had managed: its own writing system. The Meroitic script, developed around 300 BCE, replaced Egyptian hieroglyphics as the official written language of the Kushite state. It had two forms: a hieroglyphic version used for formal inscriptions and a cursive version used for everyday writing. Scholars have been able to establish its sound values, meaning they can read Meroitic aloud. What they cannot do, for the most part, is understand it. The language it encodes remains substantially undeciphered. The Kushites, in other words, were a literate civilization that history has not yet learned to hear in its own voice. During the Meroitic period, their women governed with an authority unparalleled in the ancient world. The Kandake, a title meaning queen regnant, not queen consort, exercised genuine executive and military power. The most celebrated was Amanirenas, who ruled in the late 1st century BC and led Kush's military response to the Roman annexation of Egypt. After Augustus Caesar absorbed Egypt in 30 BCE, Roman forces pushed south. Amanirenas struck back, raiding Roman-held towns, toppling Roman statues, and, in one extraordinary gesture of contempt, burying a bronze head of Augustus beneath the steps of a Kushite temple so that her people could walk across the emperor's face. She later negotiated directly with Augustus at Samos and extracted a treaty that canceled Kushite tribute obligations and pushed the Roman border back. Augustus accepted her terms. Now, the kingdom of Kush outlasted the Roman Republic. It outlasted the reign of Julius Caesar, of Augustus, of Tiberius, of Claudius, of Nero. It continued to build, trade, and govern through centuries in which the Roman world convulsed with civil wars, succession crises, and the first stirrings of its long decline. Meroe was finally sacked around 330 CE by the rising power of Aksum to the east. By then, Kush had existed as an organized state for roughly 3,000 years, longer than the interval between its fall and the present day. Sudan today has more pyramids than Egypt. The count stands at approximately 255, scattered across 3 major royal cemeteries at El Kuru, Nuri, and Meroe. They are smaller and steeper than the Egyptian pyramids, built in a distinctly Kushite style, and with a small chapel attached to the eastern face and a burial shaft descending from outside the structure rather than from within. Few Western tourists have seen them. Sudan's political turbulence across the late 20th and early 21st centuries kept them largely inaccessible, and the civilization they commemorate has never found the same place in the popular imagination that Egypt occupies. There is no obvious reason for that, beyond the accident of which archives survived and which scholars followed which evidence south. This is what Kush represents in the larger story of ancient Africa. Not a footnote to Egypt, not a footnote to Rome, but a separate and substantial civilization that endured across an extraordinary time span, produced its own architecture, its own script, its own governing traditions, and its own queens who negotiated on equal terms with the most powerful empire the Western world has ever produced. It was not hidden. It was not lost. It was, for most of the last 200 years, simply not looked for. Because the assumptions that framed the study of African history made it easier to look north than south, easier to read stone inscribed in Greek than stone inscribed in a language no one had yet taught themselves to understand. On the northern coast of Africa, on a triangular peninsula jutting into the central Mediterranean, there was once a city that controlled more territory than Rome, commanded the most powerful navy in the Western world, and had been praised by Aristotle as one of the finest examples of constitutional government in the ancient world. The city was called Carthage, the New City, in its own language. The Greeks called it Carchedon. The Romans called it Carthago. The Romans also destroyed it so thoroughly and burned its libraries so completely that almost everything Carthage ever said about itself is gone. Carthage was founded around 814 BCE by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre, on the coast of what is now Lebanon. The Phoenicians were the Mediterranean world's great seafarers and traders, the civilization that spread the alphabet across the ancient world, giving it eventually to the Greeks, who gave it to the Romans, who gave it to almost everyone else. Carthage began as a way station, a place to resupply ships moving between the eastern and western Mediterranean. It grew into something far larger. By the 3rd century BCE, it was the wealthiest and most powerful state in the western Mediterranean, with colonies and client relationships stretching from the coast of North Africa to southern Spain, Sardinia, Corsica, Sicily, and Malta. The city itself was an engineering achievement. Its harbors were the largest in the ancient world, 2 interlocking basins, one for commercial shipping and one for the war fleet, with covered docks for 220 warships and a circular admiralty island at the center. The walls that enclosed the city ran for 37 kilometers. Within them lived, at Carthage's peak, a population approaching 500,000 people, housed in a city of multi-story residential towers, temples, markets, and a citadel on the hill of the Birsa that commanded views over the entire bay. That no one who approached Carthage from the sea could mistake what they were looking at. This was a capital. What made Carthage powerful was trade, and what made trade possible was the navy. Carthaginian ships moved through the Mediterranean with a commercial confidence that no other state could match, controlling the choke points, the Strait of Gibraltar, the straits between Sicily and North Africa, and enforcing a series of treaties that kept rival powers, including Rome in its early centuries, out of the western sea lanes. The Carthaginians were not modest about this dominance. They were secretive about their trade routes in the way that any commercial power guards its advantage. But they understood exactly what they had built, and they built it deliberately. The city's political system was sophisticated enough that Aristotle, in his Politics, placed Carthage alongside Sparta and Crete as one of the few genuinely admirable constitutional states of antiquity. At its head were 2 annually elected magistrates called suffètes, a title sharing its root with the Hebrew word for judge. Below them sat a council of elders, roughly equivalent to the Roman Senate, drawn from the city's leading families and managing the treasury, foreign policy, and day-to-day administration. Below that was a popular assembly with real powers of approval and review. The whole system operated with the collegiality and the hatred of personal tyranny that characterizes states that have seen what unchecked power does. Carthage had seen it. It did not repeat it. The empire Carthage built was more commercial than territorial in character. Where Rome expanded by conquest and administration, Carthage expanded by treaty, network, and the extension of economic relationships. Its African hinterland, the fertile farmland of what is now Tunisia and northwestern Libya, was among the most productive agricultural territory in the ancient world. The Carthaginians had developed methods of irrigation, crop rotation, and soil management, sophisticated enough that a Carthaginian agronomist named Mago assembled their knowledge into a 28-volume treatise on farming that became so valuable the Roman Senate, after destroying Carthage, ordered it translated into Latin rather than let it disappear with everything else. It remains the single most substantial piece of Carthaginian writing that survives, preserved only because Rome needed it. Into the Atlantic and down the West African coast, Carthage also sent explorers. Around 520 BCE, a naval commander named Hanno sailed west through the Strait of Gibraltar with a fleet of 60 ships and a large company of settlers, founding or restoring colonies along the Moroccan coast, and then pressing further south into waters no Mediterranean civilization had previously charted. His account of the voyage, the Periplus of Hanno, survived antiquity through a single Greek manuscript, itself a translation of a Punic original that was carved onto a stone tablet in Carthage's temple. The original tablet burned in 146 BCE. What Hanno saw on that coast, islands of fire that he almost certainly identified with volcanic eruptions, creatures he called gorillae that were almost certainly chimpanzees or gorillas, was recorded by no one else for nearly 2,000 years. Carthage and Rome were, for roughly a century, one of the two dominant powers of the Western Mediterranean, and the collision between them was probably inevitable. The three Punic Wars, 264 to 241 BCE, 218 to 201 BCE, and 149 to 146 BCE, were among the most consequential conflicts of the ancient world, reshaping the Mediterranean's political order as decisively as any wars before the age of gunpowder. The first war was fought mostly at sea and over Sicily. Rome won. The second war produced Hannibal. Hannibal Barca was 30 years old when he led an army from Spain across the Pyrenees, through southern Gaul, and over the Alps into northern Italy in 218 BCE, bringing with him 37 war elephants and a force that Roman strategists had believed the terrain made impossible to deliver. He crossed the mountains in 16 days. He then spent the next 15 years fighting Rome on its own soil, winning battle after battle, at the Trebia River, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae in 216 BCE, where his forces killed at least 50,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon. The Roman state came closer to collapse in those years than it would again until the Gothic invasions of the 5th century CE. Hannibal did not take Rome. He lacked the siege equipment, and Carthage's Senate, wary of his family's power, never sent the reinforcements that might have made the difference. The Second Punic War ended in Carthage's defeat at Zama in 202 BCE. The peace terms stripped Carthage of its overseas territory, its navy, and its right to wage war without Rome's permission. The city survived as a commercial entity, wealthy, active, but increasingly resented by Roman senators who watched its recovery with alarm. The senator Cato the Elder ended almost every speech he gave in the Roman Senate on whatever subject with the same 5 words: Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He said it for years. Eventually the Senate agreed. The pretext came in 149 BCE, when Carthage defended itself against raids by the Numidian king Mansa, Rome's ally, and was charged with violating the peace treaty by fighting without permission. Rome declared war. The Third Punic War was not a war in any meaningful sense. It was a siege. Carthage held out for 3 years, its citizens converting temples into weapons workshops and cutting their own hair to string the catapults. When Scipio Aemilianus finally breached the walls in the spring of 146 BCE, and his soldiers fought their way through the city building by building street by street for 7 days. Those who survived the fighting were sold into slavery, 50,000 people. The city was burned and then demolished. The Roman Senate decreed that no one should be allowed to live there. The story that Rome salted the earth of Carthage is not true. No ancient source records it. The myth appeared in the 19th century and spread because it felt like the kind of thing Rome would do, and because it captured something real about the totality of the destruction, even if the specific detail was invented. What was true, and what no myth was needed to describe, was the burning of the libraries, everything Carthage had written, its histories, its religious texts, its diplomatic records, its literature. Whatever literature it had went up in the same fire that consumed the buildings. The only exceptions were Mago's farming manual, retrieved for practical use, and Hanno's voyage account, preserved in Greek translation. Everything else is gone. What this means in practice is that every account of Carthage that survives was written by its enemies or by the Greeks who observed it from a competitive distance. Polybius, whose account of the Punic Wars is the most important, was a Greek hostage held in Rome who broadly admired Roman institutions and wrote from within the Roman intellectual world. Livy wrote 2 centuries after the events. The Carthaginians themselves, what they believed about their wars, their gods, their origins, their own history, cannot be heard. A civilization of 500,000 people at its peak left almost no voice. That silence is not accidental. It was engineered. The religion of Carthage has suffered particularly from this silence. Roman and Greek writers described Carthaginian religious practices with consistent horror, including the claim that Carthage engaged in extreme ritual offerings at a site called the Tophet, a sacred burial ground dedicated to the city's youngest inhabitants. The question of what the Tophet actually was, and whether the Roman accounts represent accurate description or propaganda designed to dehumanize an enemy, remains genuinely contested among scholars. The Carthaginians cannot answer for themselves. They left no account of their own theology, no defense, no explanation. Yet the accusation has stood largely unchallenged for 2,000 years because the accused were given no opportunity to speak. This is the archive problem at its most extreme. Egypt's archive survived so completely that we have almost too much: inventory lists, love poetry, medical manuals, administrative complaints about late grain deliveries. Kush's archive survived partially in a script still being deciphered. Carthage's archive did not survive at all. What we know of Carthage is what Rome chose to tell us. The perspective of the victor, filtered through the particular combination of genuine admiration and ethnic contempt that Rome reserved for the people it had conquered and exterminated. The result is a civilization of extraordinary sophistication and reach that exists in historical memory primarily as Hannibal and his elephants. One man's genius extracted from the culture that produced him, and the culture itself reduced to rubble and ash. In the 3rd century CE, a Persian prophet named Mani sat down to describe the structure of the world as he understood it. He was a meticulous thinker, the founder of a religion that would eventually spread from the Atlantic coast of North Africa to the borders of China. And when he catalogued the 4 great powers of his time, his list was not Europe-centered or Mediterranean-centered. It was global. The 4 kingdoms, he wrote, were Persia, Rome, China, and Aksum. Not Greece, not Egypt, already long absorbed into Rome's administrative body. Aksum, you're an African kingdom in the highlands of what is now northern Ethiopia. named alongside the three empires that every schoolchild in the modern world has been taught to regard as the pillars of the ancient world. Aksum's origins lie in the highlands of Tigray, in the northern tip of the Ethiopian plateau, where communities had been farming wheat and barley and herding cattle for at least a millennium before the kingdom consolidated in the 1st century CE. The land was fertile then in ways it is not now. Centuries of cultivation, deforestation, and erosion have stripped it considerably. And the highland plateau gave its inhabitants the dual advantage of defensive elevation and proximity to the Afar lowlands, where the Red Sea coast lay accessible within a few days' journey. That geography was Aksum's commercial foundation. The highland produced the surplus. The coast moved it to the world. The port that made Aksum rich was Adulis, on the Red Sea shore of what is now Eritrea. By the 1st century CE, it was one of the busiest transshipment points in the ancient world, a place where the trade routes connecting the Roman Empire to India converged on a single harbor, and where African goods bound for the Mediterranean met Asian goods bound for the interior of Africa. Roman merchants unloaded wine, glassware, and fine cloth. Aksumite merchants loaded ivory, tortoiseshell, gold, emeralds, incense, and live animals. Indian traders exchanged silk and pepper and steel. The port operated in Greek, Latin, South Arabian, Ge'ez, and probably several other languages simultaneously. It was, in the precise commercial sense of the word, a hub. What Aksum exported above all else was ivory. The elephant herds of the African interior were vast, and the Aksumite trade network reached deep into the highland and lowland territories where they lived, funneling tusks northward through a chain of markets, from the interior collection points to the highland capital to the coast at Adulis. Rome's appetite for ivory was essentially limitless. It went into furniture, into decorative panels, into statuary, into the handles of weapons carried by emperors. A significant portion of the ivory that furnished the Roman world passed through Adulis, and a significant portion of the tax revenue that funded the Aksumite state came from controlling that passage. The capital city of Aksum was not a small administrative settlement. At its height, it housed somewhere between 20 and perhaps 50,000 people. Precise figures are unavailable. In a city of multi-story stone and timber buildings, royal palaces, temples, markets, and the enormous stelae fields that still stand today at the northern edge of the modern town. Merchants and travelers arrived from Rome, from Persia, from the Arabian Peninsula, from India, from the Nile corridor. Ge'ez was the official language of the court and administration. Greek was the language of commerce and diplomatic correspondence. The inscriptions of King Ezana, the most important of the Aksumite rulers, were carved in three languages: Ge'ez, South Arabian, and Greek, an ancient Ethiopian ruler communicating simultaneously with three distinct spheres of the ancient world. In the stelae are the most visible monument of what Aksum built, and they remain one of the most extraordinary feats of engineering in African history. These were not simple standing stones. They were monolithic granite towers, carved from single blocks of stone quarried several kilometers from the city, transported without wheeled vehicles or draft animals capable of the load, and raised to heights that no other monument of the ancient African world outside Egypt had attempted. The largest ever erected stood 97 feet high, roughly equivalent to a 10-story building, and was a single piece of stone. It fell, probably during or shortly after erection, and its broken sections still lie in the stelae field today. The largest still standing is 79 feet. These were royal funerary monuments, carved to resemble multi-story buildings complete with false doors, false windows, and false lintels, architecture in stone, permanent records of a city that could build in ways that no surrounding culture had matched. Around the year 270 CE, the Aksumite king Indubis did something that fewer than a handful of states in the ancient world had yet managed. He minted coins, gold, silver, and bronze, a full currency system, produced in the Aksumite capital with the king's face on one side and royal inscriptions on the other. These were the only coins produced anywhere in sub-Saharan Africa in the ancient period. They circulated through the Red Sea trade network, turning up in excavations as far away as India and the Arabian Peninsula. When the conversion weight of Aksumite gold coins shifted in the early 4th century to track changes in the Roman solidus, it revealed a commercial relationship so tightly integrated that an Aksumite treasurer was watching Roman monetary policy and adjusting accordingly. These were not peripheral actors, they were participants. In the 320s CE, a young man named Ezana came to the Aksumite throne. He was not yet an adult, and his mother ruled as regent for the first years of his kingship. During that regency, a scholar from the Phoenician city of Tyre named Frumentius, who had arrived at the Aksumite court years earlier under complicated circumstances and had risen to become a senior advisor and then tutor to the young prince, began spreading the Christian faith among the court's merchants and officials. Frumentius eventually made the journey to Alexandria to meet the Coptic patriarch Athanasius, who appointed him the first bishop of Aksum. When Ezana assumed full power, he converted, and Christianity became the state religion of the Aksumite Empire. Aksum was the first sub-Saharan African state to adopt Christianity, and it did so before the Roman Empire made it the official religion of its own domain. Ezana's coins recorded the conversion in real time. The earlier coins carried the pre-Christian royal symbol, a disk and crescent, and inscriptions invoking the old gods of the Aksumite pantheon. After the conversion, the disk and crescent disappeared. In their place appeared the cross, surrounded by inscriptions that asked the God of heaven and earth to bless the king. These are the earliest coins anywhere in the world to bear the Christian cross as an official state symbol. When the Byzantine Emperor Constantius II, an Arian Christian at odds with the Coptic orthodoxy that Frumentius had brought to Aksum, wrote to Ezana demanding that Frumentius be sent to Constantinople to answer charges of heresy, Ezana declined. An African king ignored a Byzantine emperor's theological instructions and went his own way. 10. Ezana was also a military ruler of considerable energy. His inscriptions record campaigns against neighboring peoples, the Piye to the north, the Noba along the Nile, and it was almost certainly during his reign or his immediate predecessors that Aksumite forces sacked Meroe and effectively ended the kingdom of Kush as a political entity. The inscription recording this campaign was written in Ge'ez and erected at Meroe itself. One African civilization had absorbed another, and the victor left its own writing at the site of the vanquished's capital. The Nile corridor, which had been Kush's spine for 3,000 years, now fed into a different political gravity. Aksum had become the dominant state of the northeastern African interior. By the 6th century, Aksumite power had extended across the Red Sea into the Arabian Peninsula. Around 520 CE, King Caleb led a military expedition into what is now Yemen against the Himyarite king Du-Nuwas, who had been persecuting the Christian community in his territory. The campaign succeeded. An Aksumite general named Abrahe governed Yemen in Aksum's name for decades, and building churches and maintaining the connection between the African highlands and the Arabian coast. It was the furthest extension of Aksumite military power, an African state governing a portion of the Arabian Peninsula at the same time that the Byzantine and Persian empires were contending for the same region. Aksum was not watching that contest from the margins. It was a participant in it. The campaigns in Arabia were also, in retrospect, the beginning of the end. They cost more than they returned. The Persian Empire eventually expelled the Aksumite presence from Yemen in the 570s, ending Aksum's trans-Red Sea dominion. Then, in the 7th century, the rise of Islam transformed the political geography of the entire region. An Arab expansion across North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula closed off the trade routes that had sustained Adulis for 5 centuries. The Roman and Byzantine markets that had consumed Aksumite ivory contracted, or vanished. The port declined. The coin output slowed and then stopped. The court withdrew from Aksum into the Ethiopian highlands, and the capital was eventually abandoned around 630 CE. What survived was the church. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church, founded in the Aksumite period, rooted in the theology that Frumentius brought from Alexandria, has maintained continuous existence from the 4th century to the present day. It is one of the oldest continuously functioning Christian institutions on earth. The liturgical language it preserved was Ge'ez, the same script that the Aksumite kings had used to inscribe their stelae and their coins and their military victories. That language is still used in Ethiopian Orthodox worship today. The archive, in this case, did not burn. It was carried forward in the mouths of priests and the hands of monks, copied and recopied across 15 centuries, and it still exists. This is what makes Aksum the most instructive case in the documentary's central argument. Here was an African civilization that left stone monuments, a written script, a coin series, a surviving religious tradition, and the testimony of 3 languages. It was named by one of antiquity's most cosmopolitan thinkers as one of the 4 great powers of the world. It minted the first Christian coins in history. It governed territory on 2 continents, and it remains, in the standard Western history curriculum, a footnote at best, mentioned occasionally in the context of early Christianity or the Horn of Africa, rarely given the full treatment that its record, by any objective measure, demands. The archives survived. The attention did not follow. The reason is not difficult to identify. Aksum sits at the intersection of several categories that Western historiography has tended to treat as separate: African history, Middle Eastern history, early Christian history, ancient trade history, and falls fully into none of them. It is too far south for the standard Mediterranean narrative, too Christian for the standard African history narrative, which tends to emphasize pre-colonial religious traditions, too African for the standard church history narrative, which anchors Christianity in Rome and Constantinople. Aksum slips through the cracks, not because its record is thin, but because the categories that organize Western historical knowledge were not built to hold it. That failure of categorization is itself instructive. It demonstrates that the archive problem is not only about what survived and what decayed, it is also about what gets read, what gets taught, and what conceptual frameworks determine which evidence counts as central and which counts as peripheral. Aksum's stelae are still standing. Its coins are in museum collections across 3 continents. Its church is still functioning. The problem was never the evidence. The problem was where people were trained to look. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth. It covers roughly 9 million square kilometers, an area comparable to the continental United States, and it runs like a wound across the top of Africa, separating the Mediterranean coast from everything south of it with a barrier so vast and so hostile that most people who look at a map of the continent treat it as a fixed feature of geography, as permanent and unchallengeable as the Atlantic Ocean. It is not permanent. It has not always been there. For long stretches of human prehistory, the Sahara was green. The mechanism was orbital. The Earth's axial tilt shifts on a cycle of roughly 23,000 years, altering the angle at which sunlight strikes the northern hemisphere in summer. When the tilt is at its maximum, the African monsoon intensifies, it driving rainfall far deeper into the Saharan interior than it reaches today. Between approximately 14,000 and 5,000 years before the present, this orbital configuration produced what geologists call the African humid period, a phase during which the Sahara received enough rainfall to sustain grasses, trees, rivers, and permanent lakes across territory that is now nearly lifeless desert. It was not a marginal change. It was a transformation. At its peak, around 7,000 years before the present, a lake sat in the center of what is now the Chad Basin that was larger than the modern Caspian Sea. Lake Megachad covered more than 400,000 square kilometers of north-central Africa, draining westward through river systems that reached the Atlantic. Across the Saharan interior, and dozens of other lakes filled depressions that are now bone-dry playas. Rivers ran where only sand dunes run today. The Saharan highlands of the Ahagar and Tibesti mountains caught enough rainfall to feed permanent watercourses that flowed out into the surrounding plains. The landscape was wet in the way that the modern Sahel is wet, intermittently, seasonally, unreliably, but sufficiently wet to sustain life at a scale the modern desert cannot support. People live there. The rock art they left behind is among the most extensive and most vivid in the world. Hundreds of thousands of images carved and painted onto stone outcrops across the Algerian Sahara, the Libyan Fezzan, the Tassili Niger Plateau, and the Tibesti uplands. The animals depicted in that art tell the story of the climate more precisely than any geological core sample. Hippopotami, whose physiology requires permanent water. Crocodiles, who cannot survive without it. Giraffes and elephants, who require grassland and browse. Fish, water birds, and cattle, domestic cattle, herded by people who move through a landscape that could sustain them, watched over by herders whose descendants would eventually carry cattle culture to the Nile Valley when the rains retreated. Those cattle herders were not marginal pastoralists scratching a living at the edge of habitability. They were the inhabitants of a functioning ecological system that stretched from the Atlantic coast of what is now Mauritania to the Nile corridor in the east, a distance of over 5,000 kilometers. Communities across this system shared pottery traditions, burial practices, and livestock keeping techniques in a way that indicates sustained contact and movement. Genetic connections ran across what is now an uncrossable barrier. The Sahara was not separating the populations on either side of it. It was connecting them. The drying began around 5,000 years before the present. The orbital cycle shifted, the monsoon contracted, and the rains retreated southward. The process was probably not uniform. There were wetter intervals within the general drying, pauses in the desertification that allowed human communities to hold on longer than the average trajectory suggested. But the overall direction was irreversible. Lake Megachad shrank to a fraction of its former extent within a few centuries. The Saharan rivers ran seasonally and then stopped running at all. The grasslands dried to scrub, and the scrub dried to sand. The rock art stopped being made. The populations left. Where they went matters enormously for the history of the continent. Communities from the central Saharan interior moved toward the one reliable water source in the region, the Nile. This is one of the key dynamics behind the population growth and social consolidation that produced the early Egyptian state. The Nile Valley received an influx of people from the desiccating interior, people who brought with them cattle culture, pottery traditions, and probably social innovations developed in the more dispersed communities of the Green Sahara. Egypt was not built only by the people of the Nile Valley. It was built partly by the people the desert expelled. Yet other communities moved south, into the Sahel and the savanna zones below the expanding desert. This southward movement is one of the drivers of the Bantu expansion. The gradual spread of Bantu-speaking farming and herding communities across sub-Saharan Africa over several thousand years, one of the most consequential demographic processes in African history. The closing of the Sahara did not merely rearrange populations. It set in motion migrations that reshaped the human geography of the entire continent, establishing the linguistic and cultural patterns that still define sub-Saharan Africa today. In the desert itself, some communities did not leave. They adapted. In the Fezzan region of what is now southwestern Libya, a people the Romans called the Garamantes built one of the ancient world's most audacious hydraulic engineering projects. They dug a network of underground irrigation channels, fogaras, that reached down into ancient aquifers left over from the wetter periods and channeled that fossil water by gravity to the agricultural fields and cities they maintained on the desert surface. More than 460 kilometers of these underground channels have been mapped by modern archaeologists. They ran sometimes more than 6 kilometers in length, with vertical shafts descending every 10 meters or so for access and maintenance. The Garamantes used this system to grow cereals, grapes, olives, and dates in the middle of the world's largest hot desert. And at their peak, they maintained 3 substantial cities and a population that probably reached 50,000 people. 10. The Garamantes were not isolated. They sat on the central Saharan trade route connecting the Mediterranean coast to the sub-Saharan interior, and they controlled it. Roman goods, wine, glass, fine metalwork, passed through their territory heading south. Sub-Saharan goods, gold, ivory, enslaved people, passed through heading north. The Romans knew the Garamantes as a significant power in the central Saharan region and engaged with them diplomatically as well as militarily. When the Foghara system eventually exhausted the fossil aquifer it had been drawing on for centuries, the Garamantian state collapsed. The water ran out around the 7th century CE, and with it went the agriculture and the cities. The desert reclaimed the ground above the empty channels, and the Garamantes vanished from the historical record almost without trace. The camel changed everything that came after. Camels came into widespread use in North Africa around the 1st century CE, having arrived from Arabia through Egypt and the Sudan. A camel could travel 40 to 50 kilometers per day while carrying 240 kilograms of cargo. It could go without water for days in conditions that would kill a horse or a donkey within hours. It required no infrastructure, no fogharas, no oases maintained at enormous labor cost, beyond knowledge of where water sources existed and how far apart they were. With camels, the Sahara was not passable. It was a road. The formal trans-Saharan trade routes that would sustain the great medieval empires of West Africa, the Ghana Empire, the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire, were built on camel transport, and they reached their full development only after the 8th century CE with the spread of Islam. But the connections they exploited were older than the camel, older than Islam, older than the desert itself in its current form. The trade between the Mediterranean world and the sub-Saharan interior had been happening for thousands of years through routes that preceded the formal caravan system, through the Garamantian corridor, through the Nile, through the Red Sea, through networks of contact that the Green Sahara had established when populations on either side of what became the desert were still living in the same ecological system. This is why the Sahara matters for the documentary's central argument in a way that goes beyond its own intrinsic interest. The desertification of the Sahara is the single most important climatic event in African history. It fragmented a continental population that had been in sustained contact. It created the ecological barrier that would make sub-Saharan Africa appear separate from North Africa to external observers, and separate from itself to later historians who drew sharp lines between the Mediterranean world and everything south of the sand. Those lines were not always there. They were made by a shift in the planet's orbit, accelerated probably by the grazing pressure of the cattle herders who loved their landscape too well, and they have been treated ever since as a permanent feature of geography rather than what they actually are, a relatively recent and, on geological timescales, temporary arrangement. The Sahara is not Africa's past, it is Africa's interruption. The history of the continent before that interruption, the Green Sahara's cattle cultures, its rock art, its lake communities, its continental scale connectivity, is as much a part of the African story as Egypt or Kush or Mali. And the history of how communities adapted to the interruption, the Garamantes tapping fossil water, the Nile Valley absorbing the displaced, the camel eventually stitching the severed halves back together, is the story of human ingenuity operating at the scale of a continent. Most textbooks give it a paragraph, if that. it deserves rather more. In the summer of 1324, a man passed through Cairo with a caravan so large that the city ground to a halt, trying to absorb it. He had 60,000 people in his retinue: soldiers, officials, scholars, servants, enslaved attendants. 500 of those attendants walked ahead of the procession, each carrying a staff of solid gold weighing about 2.5 kilograms. 100 camels followed, each carrying bags of gold dust. The man himself rode at the center of it all, dressed in robes of silk and brocade, accompanied by horses with golden bridles and by the music of instruments that Cairene merchants had never heard before. His name was Musa, and he was the emperor of Mali. Musa, known to history as Mansa Musa, thus the title, meaning King of Kings, ruled an empire that covered roughly the western third of the African continent and contained at that moment a larger share of the world's gold supply than any other state on earth. His empire controlled the goldfields of Bambouk and Bure in what is now Guinea and Senegal, alluvial deposits so rich that gold dust could be panned from riverbeds and shallow shaft mines in quantities that kept the entire Mediterranean economy supplied with the metal it needed to mint its coins, purchase its luxuries, and pay its armies. When Musa passed through Cairo on his way to Mecca and simply gave gold away, to officials, to merchants, to beggars at the roadside, he flooded the Egyptian market with enough of it to crash the commodity's value. The price of gold in Egypt did not recover for more than a decade. The Mali Empire that produced this man and this moment did not arrive suddenly. It was the inheritor of centuries of West African state-building that reached back through the Ghana Empire and further still into the Sahelian communities that had been building complex political structures since at least the 5th century CE. The immediate predecessor state, Ghana, located not in the territory of the modern nation of that name, but in what is now southern Mauritania and western Mali, had controlled the gold trade routes long before Sundiata Keita reorganized the region in the 13th century. What Mali added was scale, administrative coherence, and the political genius to hold together an empire of extraordinary geographic extent through a combination of military power, commercial control, and religious legitimacy. Sundiata Keita founded the Mali Empire in 1235, defeating the Soso king Sumanguru Kante at the Battle of Kirina and unifying a coalition of Mande-speaking peoples under a single authority. The story of Sundiata is known in extraordinary detail: his childhood illness, his exile, his return, the battle, the founding of the capital at Niani. And it is known in this detail not because anyone wrote it down at the time, but because the griots carried it. The griot tradition of West Africa is one of the most sophisticated systems of historical preservation ever developed by any human society. Griots were professional historian poets, hereditary custodians of genealogy, law, and political memory, trained across childhoods of intensive listening and memorization before they were permitted to perform. The training took decades. The repertoire contained centuries. The griot was not a storyteller in the casual sense. A griot was an archive. In societies where writing was not the primary technology for preserving political knowledge, the griot performed the same function as a scriptorium, with the crucial difference that a griot could also interpret, contextualize, and adapt. The oral record of West African history has sometimes been dismissed by scholars trained in documentary traditions as less reliable than written sources. That dismissal misunderstands what oral tradition is. A griot reciting a genealogy is not improvising. The performance is governed by the same commitment to accuracy as a monastic copyist, and has the additional advantage of being embedded in a living social context that can challenge and correct errors in real time. The oral archive and the documentary archive have different vulnerabilities, not different standards of truth. The Mali Empire that Sundiata founded and his successors expanded across the 13th and 14th centuries was organized around two foundational commodities: gold from the south and salt from the north. The gold fields of Bambouk and Bure produced the metal in quantities that made Mali the dominant economic power in the medieval world. The salt mines of the Sahara, particularly Tagaza in the central desert, produced a mineral without which human life in sub-Saharan West Africa was impossible, and which the forest and savanna zones could not produce themselves. The trade between these two commodities across the Saharan caravans routes that the camel had made reliable was the engine of Mali's wealth. Salt went south, gold went north. The emperor's officials taxed both at every checkpoint and grew rich beyond the Mediterranean world's ability to imagine. The political administration that managed this wealth was sophisticated. Mali's provinces were governed by officials appointed by the emperor and accountable to the center. The empire maintained a professional army and a courier network that could transmit information across vast distances. It had courts of law, systems of taxation, and, after the adoption of Islam by the Malian ruling class in the 11th century, the Arabic literacy that connected it to the broader world of Islamic scholarship, diplomacy, and commercial law. Sundiata himself had founded the empire within an oral constitutional framework. The Mandan Charter, the Kurukan Fuga, proclaimed at Kurukan Fuga after the Battle of Kurina, established principles of governance and social rights that the griot tradition has preserved for nearly 8 centuries. It is an oral document, not a written one. That does not make it less of a constitution. By the time Mansa Musa came to power in 1312, Mali was already the dominant state of the Western Sahel. Under his rule, it became something more, a state visible to the entire medieval world. Musa was devout, educated, and strategically minded. His pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 was simultaneously a religious obligation and a display of power designed to announce to the Mediterranean world the scale of what he ruled. It worked beyond any reasonable expectation. Egyptian officials who received him wrote about it for decades, and Arab geographers recorded his caravan's size and the quality of his retinue. European cartographers, working 50 years later with information filtered through multiple intermediaries, still put him on their maps. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, the most important medieval world map produced in the Western tradition, depicts Mansa Musa enthroned at the center of the African continent, holding a golden orb, the caption beside him describing him as the richest and most noble ruler of all his lands. Timbuktu, which entered Musa's empire during his reign, was the physical embodiment of what Mali had become. The city sat at the southern edge of the Sahara, where caravan routes from the north met the Niger River's waterway to the south. And it was a transshipment point first, a place where goods changed hands between the desert caravans and the river traders, and then became something more. Under Musa's patronage, the Sankor Mosque was rebuilt and staffed with scholars he had brought back from his pilgrimage. Libraries accumulated manuscripts. Students arrived from across the Islamic world. At Timbuktu's height in the 15th and 16th centuries, the city housed upward of 25,000 students and maintained collections of between 400,000 and 700,000 manuscripts on theology, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, history, and law. It was a university city, operating at the same moment as Oxford and the Sorbonne, and pursuing the same intellectual ambitions by different means. 10. Those manuscripts, the Timbuktu manuscripts, are one of the most important documentary archives in African history, and they almost did not survive to the present. When Islamist militants occupied northern Mali in 2012, they began burning the collections. A Malian scholar named Abdel Kader Haidara organized a clandestine operation to move the manuscripts south to Bamako, loading them into trunks and transporting them through checkpoints and across dangerous territory. Roughly 350,000 manuscripts were saved. The militants burned what remained. An archive built across 6 centuries survived by hours and the courage of a handful of people. The story of its near destruction is, in miniature, the story of Africa's entire documentary heritage. Extraordinarily valuable, extraordinarily vulnerable and dependent on human will for its preservation. The gold trade that sustained Mali was not simply a commercial arrangement. It was a geopolitical system. Mali did not always directly control the goldfields to its south. The mining communities of Bambouk and Bouré retained considerable autonomy, but it taxed the gold at every stage of its journey northward and controlled the routes through which it had to pass. No gold moved from sub-Saharan West Africa to the Mediterranean without passing through Mali's administrative reach. This gave the empire leverage over kingdoms and commercial networks thousands of kilometers away. When European states in the 14th century were struggling with gold shortages that constrained their economies, the solution to that shortage was in Mali's hands. The medieval European monetary system depended, and in ways that European historians rarely emphasize, on an African empire. Mali began to fragment in the late 14th century under the pressure of succession disputes, provincial rebellions, and the rising power of the Songhai Empire to the east. By the 15th century, the empire had contracted substantially, though it persisted in diminished form until the early 17th century. The Songhai that replaced it as the dominant power of the Western Sahel was itself a magnificent state. Its capital at Gao, its intellectual center at Timbuktu, its own gold trade sustaining an empire that at its peak in the early 16th century covered more territory than Mali had. The pattern of great empires succeeding each other in the Western Sahel was not an accident. It was the logical consequence of a geography that made the gold-salt trade available to whoever could control the routes, and of political cultures sophisticated enough to build the institutions that control required. The oral archive that preserved Mali's history is not a compensation for the absence of documentation. It is documentation, in a different form, stored in a different medium, with different strengths and different vulnerabilities. The griots who carried the Epic of Sundiata for 8 centuries, who encoded Mali's laws in the Kurukan Fuga, who preserved the genealogies and battle accounts and diplomatic transactions of an empire that stretched from the Atlantic to the bend of the Niger, were performing acts of historical preservation as serious and as disciplined as anything that happened in the scriptoria of medieval Europe. The fact that their archive cannot be photographed or carbon dated does not make it less real. It makes it differently real. The story of Mali is the story of what happens when trade, governance, and intellectual culture align in a single political project. At its height, Mali was simultaneously the world's primary gold supplier, a center of Islamic scholarship, a system of regional administration that held together dozens of distinct cultural communities under a shared political roof, and an imperial presence visible on maps drawn half a world away. It was not hidden. Arab geographers visited it and wrote about it in detail. The European cartographers depicted its emperor as the most powerful man in the known world. The knowledge existed. The question was always where people looked, and whether they looked at West Africa with the same expectation of substance and complexity that they brought to every other region of the medieval world. They did not. The gold that sustained the medieval Mediterranean economy was African gold. The salt that preserved food across the Sahel came from African mines. The manuscripts that preserved Islamic scholarship through some of the most turbulent centuries of the medieval period were written, copied, and stored in an African city. Mali was not on the margins of the medieval world. In a number of the ways that actually mattered, currency supply, intellectual production, political scale, it was at the center of it. And the difficulty was never the evidence. The difficulty was the frame. There is a footnote to the Catalan Atlas that deserves to be stated plainly. The map was made 50 years after Mansa Musa's pilgrimage. Its makers had never been to Mali. They had never met a Malian. They drew him anyway, enthroned, crowned, golden, because the reports that had reached them, filtered through Cairo and through Arab geographic writing and through the commercial networks of the Mediterranean, were simply too substantial to ignore. Even from 5,000 kilometers away in 1375, working from second- and third-hand accounts in a language neither Mansa Musa nor his people would have spoken, that the cartographers of Majorca understood that the most powerful figure on the African continent was sitting on a throne of gold at the center of a world they had barely begun to comprehend. The comprehension was always possible. The will to comprehend was the variable. And the oral tradition that preserved all of this, that carried Sundiata's story, the Kurukan Fuga's principles, the genealogies of the kings, the names of the battles, the routes of the caravans, was not a primitive substitute for writing. It was a technology. It was a choice. In a continent where the conditions for documentary preservation were often hostile, where papyrus rotted and wood burned and mud brick dissolved back into earth, the investment in human memory was not a failure of sophistication. It was the most sophisticated response available to the archive problem that this documentary has been tracing from the beginning. The griots were not telling stories. They were maintaining a record. The distinction matters. On a granite plateau in the southeastern corner of what is now Zimbabwe, where the land rises between the Zambezi and the Limpopo rivers, there are walls. They curve across the hillside and spread through the valley below with a logic that only becomes clear once you understand what they were for. The largest of them, the Great Enclosure, runs for more than 250 meters in a long ellipse, reaching 11 meters high at its tallest, more than 5 meters thick at its base. Every stone was cut and placed without mortar. The walls hold themselves up by gravity and by the precision with which each block was fitted to the one beside it. They have done this for 700 years. The city these walls enclosed was called, in the language of the people who built it, Zimbabwe, houses of stone. The Shona-speaking ancestors of the people who live in that part of southern Africa today began building here in the 11th century, constructing an urban center that would grow over the following 3 centuries into the largest stone structure in sub-Saharan Africa. At its peak, somewhere between 10,000 and 20,000 people lived within the city and its surrounding settlements, a population comparable to medieval London, sustained by the gold and cattle trade that made the Zimbabwe Plateau one of the most commercially active zones in the pre-colonial African interior. The plateau had been inhabited long before the city rose. Iron Age farmers had worked the land for centuries, growing millet and sorghum, herding cattle, and trading iron tools and finished goods through regional networks that stretched east toward the Indian Ocean coast. The Shona-speaking communities that would eventually build Great Zimbabwe were the product of this longer Iron Age tradition, not foreign arrivals, not Mediterranean colonists, not the agents of any civilization external to the African interior, but the direct descendants of the farming and herding cultures that had occupied the plateau for generations. They built in stone because stone was available. They built at this particular scale because their wealth and the political consolidation that wealth made possible had reached the point where monumental building was both achievable and necessary. What made Great Zimbabwe wealthy was its position. The city sat at the intersection of the southern African gold trade and the Indian Ocean commercial network. Gold from the mines of the plateau and the surrounding region moved eastward through a chain of Swahili coast ports to the ships that crossed the Indian Ocean to Arabia, Persia, and India. In return, the city received goods from across the known world. The evidence is still in the ground. Chinese porcelain, Persian glass beads, Syrian glassware, coins from Kilwa on the East African coast, and the stone crucibles in which local goldsmiths refine their metal before shipping it out. A resident of Great Zimbabwe in the 14th century would have been familiar with the products of at least 4 continents. The city was not isolated. It was a node. Within the Great Enclosure, the ruling family lived and conducted the rituals that legitimized their authority. The conical tower at the enclosure's interior, a solid, windowless structure that served no obvious defensive or residential purpose, was almost certainly ceremonial, a permanent stone expression of royal and spiritual power. Surrounding the stone complex, the broader population lived in clay and timber structures that have long since returned to earth. The stone survives. The daily life of the city's tens of thousands has left almost nothing. This is the familiar asymmetry. The ritual outlasts the domestic, the monumental outlasts the ordinary, and what we call the record is always the residue of one specific kind of human activity rather than a representative sample of everything that happened. On the walls of the great enclosure, carved from soapstone and installed on the monoliths that crowned the structures, stood a series of birds. 8 of them have been recovered, about 40 centimeters tall, perched on columns nearly a meter high, each depicting a bird of prey with features that Shona culture associated with the divine. The battler eagle, in Shona tradition, was Chapung, a messenger from Wari, the creator god, and from the ancestors. The fish eagle was the totem of royal lineages. The birds on the walls of Great Zimbabwe probably marked the presence of the sacred within the city's political architecture, declaring the legitimacy of the ruling family's connection to the divine and the ancestral. They were not decorations. They were statements. One of those soapstone birds now sits at Groote Schuur, the former mansion of Cecil Rhodes in Cape Town. Rhodes acquired it in the 1890s when the ruins of Great Zimbabwe had just been incorporated into the territory his British South Africa Company was administering, a territory that would become Southern Rhodesia, named for him. The bird was taken as a souvenir of conquest. The irony that it became the national emblem of independent Zimbabwe in 1980, appearing on the flag, the coins, if the coat of arms, and that one of the original sculptures remained in the house of the man who had refused to believe Africans could have made it, speaks to the complexity of what Great Zimbabwe's history has always been. Simultaneously, a physical site, an archaeological problem, and a political argument. The political argument began the moment European colonists encountered the ruins. Karl Mauch, a German explorer who visited in 1871, saw the walls and immediately decided that Africans could not have built them. He proposed instead that they were the work of Phoenicians, or perhaps the ruins of the biblical Ophir, the legendary source of King Solomon's gold, built by ancient Mediterranean civilizations who had since departed. The wooden lintel he found at the site, he decided, must be Lebanese cedar, being imported by the builders from the Levant. He tested this hypothesis by biting the wood and comparing its taste to a pencil he was carrying. It tasted, he concluded, similar. The lintel was local timber. The wood tasting test, conducted in 1871 by a trained European geographer, is the epistemological low point of Great Zimbabwe's long scholarly history. Mauch's misattribution was not accidental. It served the interests of the colonial project. If Great Zimbabwe was built by Africans, then Africans had built stone cities, administered trade networks, and organized states of considerable sophistication before European contact. This was incompatible with the justifying logic of colonialism, the claim that European civilization was bringing order, literacy, and development to a continent that had existed in primordial darkness. So the ruins were explained away. Theodore Bent, the archaeologist Cecil Rhodes hired in 1891 to investigate the site, concluded that it had been built by a Phoenician-influenced culture, and that the local Shona population were later arrivals who had merely occupied a site they had nothing to do with. His excavation destroyed much of the site's stratigraphy in the process, making it impossible for later archaeologists to recover the chronological record his digging had erased. After Bent came Richard Hall, a journalist and amateur archaeologist appointed by Rhodes to manage the site. Hall's method of excavation was to remove what he called the Kafir filth, the cultural debris left by the Shona people who had inhabited the site, in order to reveal the authentic ancient structures beneath. There he removed 9 feet of archaeological deposit from the great enclosure, discarding irreplaceable evidence of the site's occupation history. The language of his reports is a document of colonial ideology as much as it is a document of excavation. The explicit belief that Shona material culture was contamination, and that the real history of the site lay in whatever remained once African evidence had been cleared away. The scientific consensus was established twice, and both times it was resisted. David Randall McIver excavated the site in 1905 and demonstrated, through careful stratigraphy and artifact analysis, that Great Zimbabwe was built by indigenous Africans during the medieval period. His findings were rejected by the colonial establishment. Gertrude Caton Thompson excavated in 1929 with a team that included Kathleen Kenyon and reached the same conclusion with more extensive evidence. The ceramic traditions, the structural techniques, and the spatial organization of the site were all consistent with local Shona culture and inconsistent with any proposed external origin. Caton Thompson published her results in 1931 in the Zimbabwe Culture. She received hate mail. The colonial government of Rhodesia in the 1960s and 1970s made denial official. Archaeologists working at Great Zimbabwe were instructed not to publicly attribute the site's construction to Africans. One archaeologist, Ken Mufuka, produced a booklet arguing for African origins and was censored by the government. Tour guides at the site were required to present alternative theories, Phoenician, Arab, or simply unknown, rather than the explanation the evidence had supported for over half a century. A government that was simultaneously claiming the right to govern the African majority on the grounds of their supposed developmental incapacity was suppressing evidence that Africans had built, 5 centuries earlier, the largest stone structure south of the Sahara. When Zimbabwe became independent in 1980, the country took its name from the ruins, Dzimba Dzamabwe, houses of stone, and the soapstone bird became the national symbol. The political reclamation was complete. The scientific question had been settled. What remained was the archaeological work of actually understanding what Great Zimbabwe was, not what it was not what colonial administrators had wished it to be, but what it actually was, a functioning city, a center of regional power, a node in an Indian Ocean trade network, the capital of a state that covered perhaps 50,000 square kilometers and included over 150 subsidiary stone enclosures scattered across the plateau. That work continues, and it continues to find things. The crucibles used to refine gold, the density of the population that the agricultural and pastoral systems could sustain, the spatial organization of the enclosures and what it reveals about the social hierarchy of the city's inhabitants, the elite in stone, the broader population in clay and timber, the distinction between the two encoded in the permanence of the material each group used to build. The decline of the city in the mid-15th century, probably driven by a combination of environmental degradation from overgrazing and a shifting trade routes that redirected commerce northward, and the political fragmentation that follows when any system becomes too complex to hold together under a single authority. The soapstone birds that once stood on the walls of the great enclosure are now in museums, in Harare, in Cape Town, in Oxford. One remains where it was found. The walls that held them are still standing, 7 centuries after the last stone was placed, in a landscape that has changed almost beyond recognition from the grassland and cattle country it once was. The site covers more than 700 hectares and has been barely half excavated. The full story of what Great Zimbabwe was, who lived there, how they organized themselves, what they believed, how they traded, why they left, is still being recovered carefully from the ground. What the politics of Great Zimbabwe's misattribution revealed is the third dimension of the archive problem, beyond decay and beyond selective recovery. It revealed that even when the evidence survives, and even when it is correctly interpreted, the interpretation can be suppressed by those with a political interest in a different story. The archive is not only physical, it is also institutional, the product of who funds the excavations, who publishes the findings, who trains the archaeologists, who governs the site, and who gets to decide which conclusions are acceptable and which are not. Great Zimbabwe was not lost to time. It was actively hidden by people who understood exactly what accepting it would mean and who preferred the fiction to the fact. Here's what the continent actually looks like when you draw the connections rather than the boundaries. The Nile rises in the Ethiopian highlands and in the lakes of equatorial Africa and flows north through Kush and Egypt to the Mediterranean. The gold of the Upper Nile funded Egyptian ambitions for 3,000 years. The Kushite kings who eventually sat on Egypt's throne had learned their statecraft and their theology from watching Egypt's court across the cataracts. The same river that carried Egypt's grain northward carried Nubian archers southward when Egypt wanted soldiers, and Kushite traders northward when they wanted grain. The Nile was not a boundary. It was a corridor. Extend the corridor. The incense that burned in Egyptian temples came from the Horn of Africa, from the kingdom south of Kush. As the kingdom eventually unified under the Aksumite state, that the Persian prophet Mani would rank third among the four great powers of the ancient world. Aksum's port at Adulis connected the Ethiopian highlands to the Roman Empire, to Persia, to India, and to the interior of Africa via the same upper Nile routes that fed into Kush. When Aksum sacked Meroe in the 4th century CE and ended the Kushite state, it was not destroying something alien. It was reorganizing the political geography of a corridor it had always been part of. One African civilization succeeded another in the same ecological and commercial logic that had shaped both. Run the corridor west. The Green Sahara, before it closed, connected the populations of the Nile Valley to the populations of the central Saharan interior and beyond to the Atlantic margin. When the desert dried, those connections did not disappear. They rerouted. The Nile received the displaced populations of the desiccating Sahara and incorporated them into the cultural and genetic fabric of the Egyptian and Nubian states. The trans-Saharan trade routes that the camel eventually made reliable were not inventions of the Islamic period. They were resumptions of connections that the Green Sahara had established and the desert had temporarily interrupted. The same goods that crossed the Sahara in Tuareg caravans in the 14th century CE had crossed it in the heads and hands of cattle herders in the 7th millennium BCE. Follow the gold south. The gold trade that sustained the Mali Empire in the west was structurally parallel to the gold trade that sustained Great Zimbabwe in the south. Both were African states that controlled access to the continent's most commercially valuable mineral and taxed it through choke points that the geography of their respective regions made unavoidable. Both connected to the Mediterranean, Mali through the trans-Saharan routes to North Africa, Zimbabwe through the Swahili coast to the Indian Ocean, and from there to Arabia and the Mediterranean's eastern end. The gold that arrived in 14th century Cairo might have come from the bambuk and bure fields of the western Sahel, or it might have come via Kilwa and the Red Sea from the mines of the Zimbabwe plateau. The Mediterranean did not know the difference. What it knew was that Africa was supplying the metal that made its economies function. This is the continental logic that the single story, the corrective, the list of overlooked civilizations, the rehabilitation narrative, tends to miss. The civilizations covered in this documentary were not simply impressive in isolation. They were impressive in connection. Egypt was not great despite its location on the African continent. It was great partly because of the resources that continent supplied to it. Kush was not simply a footnote to Egypt. It was Egypt's supplier, its rival, its eventual ruler, and its southern anchor in a Nile corridor that both states depended on for their survival. Aksum was not a curiosity of the Horn. It was a node in a global trading network that connected 3 continents, and its position in that network was a direct consequence of its location in the African ecological system. Mali was not an exception to the general poverty of African history. Thus, it was the political expression of a gold economy that had been building in the Western Sahel for centuries before Sundiata Keita reorganized it under a single authority. The connections were not always peaceful or equal. Egypt colonized Nubia for 500 years. Aksum sacked Meroe. The Garamantian economy was built partly on enslaved labor that dug the Fagaras. The Mali Empire profited from the trans-Saharan slave trade. Great Zimbabwe's ruling elite lived in stone, while the population that supported them lived in clay and timber. These were not utopias. They were states, with all the hierarchy, violence, and exploitation that states across history have produced. The corrective instinct sometimes wants to present African civilizations as uniquely enlightened, as moral alternatives to the empires that colonized the continent. They were not. They were civilizations, which means they contained the full range of what human beings do when they organize themselves at scale. What they were not is primitive. What they were not is isolated. What they were not is the absence at the center of world history that the conventional curriculum implies. The archive problem, the asymmetry between what survived and what existed, between what was excavated and what was left in the ground, between what was correctly interpreted and what was actively misread, has produced a distortion. Not a conspiracy, but a distortion. A pattern of evidence that pointed consistently toward the edges of the continent, toward the dry north where things survived, toward the stone and the desert and the papyrus, and away from the wet interior where things dissolved, away from the oral and the wooden and the clay brick, away from anything that required sustained scholarly attention to recover. The distortion began accumulating long before colonialism. The bias toward durable materials and documentary archives is not a colonial invention. It is a structural feature of how any civilization's past gets preserved. Stone outlasts wood. Papyrus in desert conditions outlasts papyrus in humid ones. A text copied in a scriptorium outlasts a genealogy carried in a griot's memory if the griot's line is broken. These are facts of physics and biology, not ideology. But colonialism intensified the distortion enormously. It brought to Africa a scholarly infrastructure, excavations, museums, university departments, publication networks that was oriented toward confirming the assumptions its operators already held. It actively suppressed evidence that contradicted those assumptions, as the history of Great Zimbabwe demonstrates with unusual clarity. And it left behind, when it ended, an institutional legacy that took generations to begin dismantling. There is a specific claim that this documentary has been building toward, and it can now be stated plainly. The history of ancient Africa is not missing. It is unevenly preserved, selectively recovered, and imperfectly read. But it is not missing. Egypt's record is among the richest in the ancient world. Kush left pyramids, inscriptions, and a coinage system. Carthage left enough in Greek and Roman sources, and in Mago's farming manual and Hanno's voyage account, to reconstruct the outlines of what it was. Aksum left stone monuments, a coin series, a surviving church tradition, and inscriptions in 3 languages. Mali left the Timbuktu manuscripts, the oral archive of the griots, and the testimony of Arab geographers who visited and recorded in detail. Great Zimbabwe left its walls, its soapstone birds, its crucibles, its imported Chinese porcelain, and the physical record of a city that housed tens of thousands of people and connected to trade networks that reached the Far East. The evidence is there. The gap was never in the evidence. 10. The gap was in the questions. A historiography that began by assuming African civilizations were not worth finding in depth would, systematically, not find them in depth. An excavation methodology that treated local material culture as contamination would systematically destroy the local record. A curriculum that placed Egypt in the ancient Mediterranean rather than in northeastern Africa would systematically obscure the connections between Egypt and the civilizations to its south. A scholarly tradition that treated oral archives as inferior to documentary ones would systematically undervalue the most significant form of historical preservation across a substantial portion of the continent. The choices were not always conscious. They were often simply the choices of people following the frameworks they had inherited. But the frameworks produced a result, a version of world history in which Africa was marginal, which justified in turn the marginalization of the scholarship that might have corrected it. Yet the correction is underway. It has been underway, in fact, for most of the 20th century, in the work of Cheikh Anta Diop, who insisted on Egypt's African identity at a moment when that claim was academically unfashionable. In the archaeologists who reinstated Great Zimbabwe's African authorship against the institutional resistance of the Rhodesian government. In the scholars who have spent careers deciphering Meroitic script, translating the Timbuktu manuscripts, and mapping the Garamantian Fagara system. The scholarship exists. It is rigorous, detailed, and growing. What is not yet caught up is the popular understanding, the model that most educated people carry in their heads of what the ancient world looked like and where it was centered. That model still, in most Western educational contexts, runs roughly as follows. Civilization emerged in Mesopotamia and Egypt, developed in Greece and Rome, spread northward and westward through Europe, and produced the modern world. Africa appears in this story at 2 points, Egypt at the beginning, and the transatlantic slave trade near the end. Everything in between is silence. The silence is not justified by the evidence. It is justified by the framework, which was built to produce it, and which will continue to produce it unless the framework is replaced. Consider what the continent was actually doing during the centuries of that supposed silence. While Rome was consolidating its empire in the 1st century CE, Aksum was minting coins and trading with India. While Rome was falling in the 5th century CE, Aksum was still minting coins, and the Meroitic script was still being inscribed on temple walls. While European states in the 9th and 10th centuries were organizing themselves into the feudal structures that preceded the medieval period, the Ghana Empire was controlling the Western Saharan gold trade, and the Swahili city-states were connecting the African interior to the Indian Ocean network. While the cathedrals of medieval Europe were being built in the 12th and 13th centuries, Great Zimbabwe's walls were being raised, and Timbuktu was accumulating the manuscript collections that would eventually number in the hundreds of thousands. The continent was not waiting. It was producing. The ecological zones that shaped which civilizations rose and which archives survived were not Africa's fault. The drying of the Sahara was not Africa's fault. The warm and humid conditions that dissolved organic material in the forest zones were not Africa's fault. The differential survival of stone over wood, of desert over jungle, of the dry north over the wet south. None of this was the result of anything the continent or its people chose. It was the result of geography and climate operating on human communities the same way they operated on every other community in the world. The difference is that for Africa, uniquely, the unevenness of the record was subsequently used to argue that the record was simply thin, that there was little to find because there was little that happened. There was not little that happened. There was little that survived in forms that a particular scholarly tradition was equipped and motivated to read. Once you see that, the history of ancient Africa stops being a problem of absence and becomes a problem of recovery. Recovery is harder than absence. Absence you can declare and move on from. Recovery requires sustained attention, methodological innovation, willingness to treat oral traditions and material culture with the same seriousness given to documentary archives and, crucially, the intellectual honesty to revise the framework when the evidence demands it. That is what the historians and archaeologists working on this material have been doing. That is what this documentary has been doing, not filling a gap, but replacing the assumption that the gap existed. Go back to the beginning, to the Kushite king sitting on the throne of the Pharaohs, to the moment that opened this reckoning. The reason that sentence sounds surprising is not because the history is obscure. It is because the framework into which that history was supposed to fit was built without room for it. Egypt was placed in the Mediterranean. Kush was placed in Africa. The two categories were treated as separate. The Kushite king on Egypt's throne disrupts that separation, not as an exotic curiosity, not as a corrective fact, but as an ordinary event in the history of a Nile corridor that had been connecting Egypt to its southern neighbors for 3,000 years before Piye marched north. The surprise is not in the history. The surprise is in the frame. And the frame, now that you can see it, can be set aside.